At first, it was meant to stay quiet. What happened inside the Reiner home was presented as a tragic but simple family loss. Headlines were careful. Language was soft. Everything felt controlled, almost rehearsed. The public was given a version that felt safe, clean, and easy to accept. A respected Hollywood figure, a loving wife, a sudden tragedy. Nothing more, nothing less. But silence has a way of breaking, and over time, small details began slipping through the cracks. What started as a closed private situation slowly turned into something much bigger. Information that was never meant to surface began finding its way out, not through official statements, but through whispers, leaks, and quiet confirmations from people close to the case. Each new detail made the original story feel less complete. Like investigators initially treated the situation as a straightforward family tragedy, but behind the scenes, their tone was changing. Questions that were once avoided were now being asked. Timelines were being revisited. Statements were being reviewed again and again. It became clear that the deeper they looked, the more uncomfortable the truth became. This was not just about loss. There were layers underneath that did not want to be touched. For weeks, the public saw only the polished version, a version that protected reputations and avoided controversy. But those close to the situation knew that version left too much out. It ignored tension that had been building for years. It ignored warning signs that had quietly been dismissed. And most importantly, it ignored evidence that did not fit the simple narrative everyone was being asked to believe. As more information leaked, one thing became impossible to deny. This was never just a private family matter. There were forces involved that wanted certain details buried, certain names left out, certain questions never asked. The story the world was given was incomplete by design, and once that realization set in, everything changed. What followed was not a clean investigation, but a slow unraveling. Every new discovery raised more doubts. Every unanswered question made the silence louder. The case that was supposed to fade away quietly began pulling attention it could no longer escape. And the more attention it drew, the clearer it became that this tragedy was connected to something far bigger than anyone had been told. And this was not just about what happened inside one home. It was about what people chose to hide afterward. And once that door opened, there was no closing it again. Romy Reiner never expected that day to change her life forever. When she arrived at her parents' Brentwood home, nothing looked wrong from the outside. The gates were closed, the driveway was quiet, the house stood exactly as it always had. But something felt off in a way she couldn't explain. The silence was too heavy. No music, no movement, no familiar sounds that usually made the house feel alive. She walked toward the door believing there had been a simple misunderstanding. Maybe her parents didn't hear the bell. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe they stepped out for a moment. Her mind searched for normal answers because the truth was too frightening to consider. When she stepped inside, everything stopped. The moment Romy saw her father, her body reacted before her thoughts could catch up. She froze completely. Her legs felt weak. Her chest tightened. Her mind went blank. What she was seeing didn't make sense, and her brain refused to process it. This wasn't shock that could be hidden or controlled. It was the kind that shuts a person down entirely. Romy did not scream for help. She did not reach for her phone. She didn't even move at first. She stood there locked in place, staring at a reality she was not prepared to face. Tears came before words. Fear came before logic. Her body knew something was deeply wrong long before her mind could understand it. This is where one of the most misunderstood details of the case begins. Romy was not the person who called 911. She physically could not. She was overwhelmed, paralyzed by what she had just seen. Trauma experts later explained that this kind of reaction is common in moments of extreme shock. The body enters survival mode. Decision-making disappears. The emergency call was made by the person who arrived with her. He saw Romy collapse emotionally within seconds. He saw her hands shaking, her breathing uneven, her eyes unfocused. There was no hesitation on his part. He stepped in because someone had to. That single action would later become one of the most twisted details in the public narrative. Online, people questioned why Romy didn't call for help herself. Some even tried to turn that moment into suspicion. But those who understand trauma know the truth is much simpler. This was not avoidance. This was not guilt. This was a daughter walking into a nightmare and losing all sense of control in an instant. As Romy stumbled back outside, gasping for air, the reality of the situation finally began to break through. Her father was unresponsive. Nothing about this felt accidental. Nothing felt natural. And yet she still had no idea that this was only part of what awaited her inside that house. At that moment, Romy believed she was facing the worst moment of her life. She didn't yet know that more devastating truths were still hidden within those walls. All she knew was that her world had just shattered, and there was no way to piece it back together again. At first, it sounded like a small detail, almost insignificant. Who made the emergency call? In most cases, that question barely matters. But in this story, it quietly shifted the entire narrative. And once people learned that Romy Reiner was not the one who called 911, speculation exploded. What should have been understood as a human reaction to trauma was instead twisted into something darker. The internet moved faster than facts. Comment sections filled with theories. People who had never experienced real shock suddenly became experts on how grief should look. They asked why Romy didn't act differently, why she didn't respond faster, why she didn't sound a certain way. What they failed to understand was that trauma does not follow rules. It doesn't wait for logic. It takes over without warning. According to those close to the situation, Romy's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The moment she saw her father, her body shut down. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands went numb. Words wouldn't come out. She wasn't thinking about phones, police, or explanations. She was trying to survive what her mind could not accept. This is why the person with her stepped in. He didn't analyze the situation or hesitate. He saw Romy breaking down in front of him and knew she was unable to function. He made the call because someone had to. That decision was instinctive, not strategic. It wasn't planned. It wasn't staged. It was the most basic human response in a moment of crisis. Despite this, the detail was quickly turned against her. Online narratives began suggesting that if she didn't make the call herself, there must be something she was hiding. That assumption ignored decades of psychological research and basic human behavior. Trauma does not create perfect responses. It creates chaos. What made the situation worse was the silence that followed. Authorities did not immediately clarify the facts. The full emergency call was not released. Explanations came slowly, if at all. That delay allowed misinformation to grow. Every unanswered question created space for doubt. And once doubt takes hold, it spreads fast. People close to the case say this was the moment the story began to spin out of control. Instead of focusing on what happened, attention shifted to how Romy reacted. Her shock was misread as suspicion. Her silence was treated like guilt. A deeply personal moment of collapse became public debate. But inside the investigation, this detail carried a very different meaning. It confirmed that Romy was not thinking clearly enough to manipulate anything. Her state matched exactly what trauma specialists describe as acute shock. There was no indication of calculation or awareness. Only panic and disbelief. That single detail, misunderstood by the public, quietly became one of the strongest signs that Romy was not involved in any wrongdoing. Yet it also revealed something else. The longer officials waited to correct the record, the more it felt like the truth was being allowed to blur. And when truth becomes unclear, people start asking why. This was no longer just about a tragic discovery. It was about how information was being handled and who benefited from confusion. The emergency call detail didn't just change how people viewed Romy. It exposed the cracks forming in the entire case. Sunday afternoons at the Reiner home followed a strict routine. It was predictable, calm, and rarely changed. Every week between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, the massage therapist arrived for a scheduled session with Rob and Michelle. Same time, same entrance, same quiet professionalism. Nothing about that day was supposed to be different. But the moment she arrived, something felt wrong. She rang the bell once. No answer. She waited, rang it again. Still nothing. Normally, someone would respond within seconds. Footsteps, a voice, or at least movement inside the house. This time, there was only silence. She tried calling their phones, straight to voicemail. She knocked again, harder now, expecting someone to open the door and apologize for the delay. But the house remained still. No sound, no sign of life. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. This wasn't just a missed appointment. This felt abnormal. The therapist had been working with the family long enough to know their habits, and they never ignored the door. They never forgot an appointment. The silence didn't make sense. And the longer she stood there, the more uneasy she became. Something inside her told her not to brush it off. Instead of leaving, she made a decision that would change everything. She called Jake Reiner. It was a simple phone call, but it triggered a chain reaction no one could stop. Romy answered, surprised and confused. Her parents had never missed a session before. At first, Romy assumed it was a small mix-up. Maybe they were running late. Maybe they stepped out for a moment. But the concern in the therapist's voice made it clear this wasn't normal. Romy said she would come over immediately. She lived nearby, just minutes away. As she drove, her mind raced through harmless explanations, anything to calm the growing tension in her chest. She didn't want to imagine the alternative. No one ever does. When Romy arrived, the house felt wrong before she even stepped inside. The driveway was empty, the doors were locked, the air felt heavy, almost staged, like time had stopped. Still, she told herself everything was fine, until it wasn't. That one phone call from the therapist is often overlooked, but it matters more than people realize. Without it, hours could have passed. The scene could have changed. Evidence could have been lost. That call forced the situation into the open before anyone was ready. Later, investigators would quietly acknowledge that this moment was critical. The therapist's instinct not to leave, not to ignore her concern, created the timeline that defined the entire case. It placed Romy at the house when she was. It explained why she arrived when she did. It removed any suggestion of planning or intent. Nothing about that Sunday afternoon was supposed to go wrong. It was routine, predictable, safe, and yet that routine was the very reason the alarm was raised so quickly. One unanswered door, one uneasy feeling, one phone call, and a family's life was permanently shattered. When the door finally opened, the inside of the house felt nothing like home. There was no noise, no warmth, no sense of life. Everything looked almost untouched. Furniture was in place. Nothing appeared broken. No signs of struggle. At first glance, it didn't look like the scene of a tragedy at all. And that was exactly what made it disturbing. Rob Reiner was found lying unresponsive. The position of his body raised quiet questions, even in those first moments. It didn't look chaotic. It didn't look rushed. It looked still, almost arranged. The room felt frozen, like time had stopped on purpose. People later described the atmosphere as unnatural, as if the house itself was holding its breath. What stood out most was how clean everything was. Too clean. There were no obvious signs of panic, no overturned furniture, no clear explanation for what had happened. For experienced responders, that kind of order can sometimes be more alarming than disorder. Chaos makes sense in emergencies. Calm does not. At that moment, Romy still believed she was seeing the full picture. She had no idea that something else had already happened inside the house. She didn't know that her mother, Michelle Reiner, had been found in a different part of the home. That information came much later, after the scene was secured and Romy was already in deep shock. Investigators would later note how controlled the environment appeared. Doors locked, rooms quiet, nothing that immediately pointed to a clear cause. It felt less like a sudden crisis and more like the aftermath of something carefully contained. That impression stayed with them. As hours passed, questions began forming quietly. Why did the house feel staged? Why was there no obvious timeline? Why did the scene not match the emotional weight of what had happened? These questions were not asked publicly, but they were written down, shared in low voices, and revisited again and again. The discovery of Michelle elsewhere in the home added another layer of confusion. The gap between when Romy found her father and when she learned about her mother was devastating. Two shocks, delivered separately. By the time the second truth reached her, the first had barely begun to settle. This separation of discoveries mattered. It showed that Romy was not walking into a full understanding of the situation. She wasn't reacting to a complete scene. She was reacting to fragments, one unbearable piece at a time. That distinction would later become critical when her actions were examined. Inside that house, nothing felt natural. The stillness, the silence, the order, it all suggested that what happened was not as simple as it first appeared. And while the public was told a story of sudden tragedy, investigators were already sensing that this scene carried answers someone did not want easily found. The house didn't tell a story of panic, it told a story of control. And that detail would haunt the case from that moment forward. The investigation followed a familiar path. And local authorities secured the scene, documented what they could, and began asking routine questions. Everything appeared standard on the surface, but that changed quickly once federal investigators became involved. The moment the FBI stepped in, the atmosphere shifted. According to people close to the case, the tone became quieter, more controlled. Fewer statements were released, fewer details were shared. Information that would normally move through official channels slowed to a near stop. It felt as if the case had been gently but firmly pulled behind a curtain. Early witness notes were taken, photos were logged, timelines were drafted. But later, some of those early materials became difficult to locate. Not erased, but no longer easy to access. Requests for clarification were met with silence. Follow-up questions were delayed. The sense of urgency faded, replaced by caution. This shift raised concern among those watching closely. Federal involvement usually brings clarity and resources. In this case, it seemed to bring restraint. Investigators began choosing their words carefully, avoiding direct answers, and narrowing the focus of public discussion. Certain angles were quietly set aside. Behind the scenes, however, the case was far from settled. Internal reviews continued. Evidence was re-examined. Timelines were compared again and again, but this work happened out of sight. What the public saw was a simplified version, stripped of its rough edges. Sources later claimed that once the FBI took control, there was a clear effort to keep the narrative contained. Not because the case lacked complexity, but because it had too much. Too many sensitive details, too many connections, too much at stake. This is when doubts began to grow. If everything was straightforward, why the secrecy? If there was nothing to hide, why limit access to information that could clear confusion? Every closed door created more suspicion. Those close to the investigation say this was the moment the case stopped feeling like a search for truth and started feeling like a balancing act. One wrong release could trigger chaos. One misstep could damage reputations, and so silence became the safest option. But silence comes at a cost. It allows rumors to grow. It lets speculation replace facts. And in this case, it allowed attention to drift toward the wrong people, while other questions stayed untouched. The FBI's presence didn't end the investigation. It changed its direction. What was once open became controlled. What was once urgent became cautious, and from that moment on, the truth would have to fight much harder to surface. For weeks, the investigation appeared to be moving in one clear direction. Public attention had settled. Media narratives felt locked in. Most people believed they already understood what had happened. Then quietly, without warning, something surfaced that changed everything. According to leaked forensic information, DNA linked to Jake Reiner was reportedly found near the exact area where Rob Reiner was discovered. That single detail landed like a shockwave behind the scenes. Up until that point, everyone believed Jake was out of town that night. His absence had been treated as fact, not assumption. His name wasn't part of the conversation until suddenly it was impossible to ignore. Investigators were forced to revisit timelines they thought were settled. Travel records were questioned. Alibis were no longer taken at face value. Small gaps that once seemed irrelevant now felt dangerous. If Jake's DNA was truly present, then someone had either lied or something had been misunderstood from the beginning. What made this revelation even more unsettling was how long it stayed hidden. Sources say federal authorities were aware of these findings for weeks before any hint of them reached the public. During that time, the focus remained elsewhere. Other family members were scrutinized. Rumors were allowed to grow. Meanwhile, this critical piece of evidence stayed buried. People close to the case began asking uncomfortable questions. Why hold back something so significant? Why allow speculation to run wild while keeping this detail quiet? The longer the silence lasted, the more intentional it began to feel. This wasn't just about DNA. It was about what DNA represented: presence, proximity, possibility. It cracked open a version of events that had already been accepted and forced investigators to consider a different reality, one where the wrong assumptions may have shaped the entire case. Once this information leaked, everything became unstable. Trust in the investigation weakened. Confidence in official timelines collapsed. Even experienced analysts admitted that if these findings were accurate, they changed the foundation of the case entirely. Yet, despite how explosive the revelation was, there was no immediate correction, no public clarification, no transparent explanation, just silence. And that silence only fueled suspicion that something far bigger was being protected. The DNA detail didn't answer questions. It created new ones. Why was Jake really believed to be away? Who confirmed it? And why did no one challenge it sooner? Each unanswered question made the situation feel less like a mistake and more like a deliberate omission. From that moment on, the case could no longer be seen as simple or contained. The narrative had cracked, and once it cracked, everything underneath was exposed to doubt. As investigators dug deeper, attention slowly shifted toward something that had nothing to do with emotions and everything to do with power. Money. More specifically, Rob Reiner's will. Valued at over $200 million, it was not just a legal document. It was leverage. And suddenly, it mattered far more than anyone expected. Sources close to the family later revealed that Rob had begun quietly updating his will in the months before his death. These were not minor adjustments. Assets were being reorganized. Trusts were being reviewed. Beneficiaries were being reconsidered. According to leaked messages and private conversations, Rob had confided in close friends that he no longer felt completely safe inside his own home. That fear, once dismissed as stress or worry, now carried a darker weight. Both Nick and Jake were reportedly aware that changes were being made. That awareness alone shifted the emotional balance inside the family. When money of that scale is involved, even small changes can create massive tension. What once felt like family support can quickly turn into resentment, suspicion, or panic. From the outside, the Reiner household still looked perfect. Private security, luxury, stability. But behind closed doors, fear had started to replace trust. Rob's concern wasn't just about safety, it was about control. Who would inherit what? Who would be protected? Who would be left exposed? Investigators began questioning whether this tragedy was driven by emotion, desperation, or something far colder. When timelines don't line up and evidence feels misplaced, money often becomes the missing piece. The will introduced motive, where there had previously been only confusion. What made this detail even more troubling was how little it was discussed publicly. While media focused on grief and family tension, the financial angle remained mostly untouched. Those close to the investigations say that was not accidental. Once money enters the picture, the case stops being personal and starts becoming dangerous. The idea that fear and fortune could collide inside one home forced investigators to reconsider everything. Was this about long-term tension finally boiling over? Or was it about control slipping away? The will didn't provide answers, but it reshaped the questions. Rob Reiner wasn't just a husband and father. He was a powerful figure with immense influence and resources. Any change he made carried consequences. And in the final months of his life, those changes may have set something in motion that could no longer be stopped. By the time the financial details came into focus, the case had already fractured. Trust was gone, narratives were unstable, and the realization settled in quietly but firmly. This was no longer just about what happened that day. It was about what had been building for years. From the outside, the Reiner home looked calm, private, and perfectly controlled. Tall gates, trimmed gardens, and complete silence from the street gave the impression of peace. To neighbors and the public, it was a dream home built for comfort and creativity. But inside, the atmosphere had been changing for years. People close to the family say tension lived in that house long before anything happened. It wasn't loud or obvious all the time. Most days, it sat quietly under the surface. Conversations were careful. Words were chosen slowly. Everyone learned which topics to avoid and when to stay silent. What looked like calm was often restraint. Arguments didn't always explode. Sometimes they stayed hidden behind closed doors. Late at night, when voices were lowered but emotions ran high. Other times, the tension showed itself in sudden mood shifts, long silences at the dinner table, or family members retreating to separate parts of the house for days at a time. Neighbors noticed things too. Late-night noise that didn't match the peaceful image of the street. Raised voices that suddenly stopped the moment someone stepped outside. Occasional visits from authorities that were explained away as misunderstandings. Nothing dramatic enough to attract attention, but enough to leave people uneasy. Inside the home, everyone was adjusting to something they didn't fully understand. The family tried to keep life normal. Meals were shared, holidays were celebrated, smiles were practiced. But beneath it all, there was a sense that something was fragile. That one wrong moment could break the balance. Friends who visited said you could feel it the moment you walked in. The house felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath. Even laughter felt careful, as if joy needed permission. No one spoke openly about the strain, but everyone felt it. Over time, fear began replacing comfort. Not constant fear, but the kind that sits quietly in the background. The kind that makes people listen closely for footsteps at night. The kind that changes how doors are locked and conversations are ended. By the time December arrived, that tension had been building for years. What happened that day did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of pressure that had been quietly increasing behind closed doors, hidden from the world that only saw success and stability. The house that once represented safety and family had slowly turned into a place of unease. And when the tragedy finally happened, it didn't create the tension. It revealed it. What most people didn't know was that the Reiner address was not new to authorities. Long before the tragedy, police had been called to the property more than once. These weren't dramatic incidents that made headlines. They were quiet visits, welfare checks, calls logged and closed without public attention, the kind of records that rarely get discussed unless something forces them into the light. The first known visit happened years earlier, after someone close to the family expressed concern that a situation inside the home felt unsafe. Officers arrived, spoke briefly, noted the address, and left. Nothing public came from it. To the outside world, and nothing had happened. But inside official systems, the house was now marked. Over the years, more calls followed. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices late at night. Others described loud crashing sounds that stopped suddenly when patrol cars arrived. Each time, officers found calm on the surface. Doors opened. Explanations were given. No one pressed charges. No arrests were made. Everything appeared under control. But repetition matters. In quiet neighborhoods like Brentwood, repeated police visits don't go unnoticed by law enforcement. Dispatchers begin to recognize the address. Officers remember the gate, the long driveway, the same explanations offered again and again. Each visit adds a layer to a picture that only authorities can see. One report filed years later was more serious than the rest. It was classified under a code used only for significant domestic disturbances. The details were sealed. Nothing was released publicly. But insiders say that entry changed how the house was viewed by authorities. It suggested the situation had crossed a line, even if no one outside the system ever heard about it. Despite these warning signs, life continued. The family worked hard to protect their image. Issues were handled privately. Problems were managed behind closed doors. And for the most part, it worked. The public never connected the dots because the dots were never visible. By the time 2025 arrived, the pattern was already established. This was not a home unknown to police. It was a place they had visited, assessed, and quietly worried about. Each call had been a signal. Each visit, a warning that something inside the house was not as stable as it appeared. When the tragedy finally occurred, those old records suddenly mattered. What once seemed minor now felt significant. The visits weren't random. They were part of a larger story that had been unfolding slowly, unseen by the public. The question investigators began asking wasn't whether there were signs. It was why those signs were never taken seriously enough to change the outcome.